Hello, everyone. I'm Lydia Kerr from the Department of English and Literature here at Utah Valley University. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the culminating roundtable discussion for a year-long speaker series on the topic of Mormonism and the challenges of whiteness. Today's event is the conclusion of a two-semester academic project in which several UVU students read and studied some of the most current. Hello, everyone. I'm Lydia Kerr from the Department of English and Literature here at Utah Valley. Apologies for the feedback. Today's event is the conclusion of a two-semester academic project in which several UVU students read and studied some of the most current work of leading scholars on the series' core theme in advance of each scholar's presentation. Recordings of those presentations are available, by the way, on the UVU Ethics Center website if you haven't already seen them. Some of these students are here with us today, along with three of our series contributors, and they've prepared some excellent questions for the discussion. We'll spend about an hour on these questions and then open the conversation up to those of you tuning in via YouTube Live. If you have a question for our roundtable, we ask that you please type it into the chat window beside the video, and a moderator will ask it on your behalf. We'll do our best to include as many of these questions as possible, but because this series is designated as an engaged learning activity for our students, and because we intend our conversation to surround the scholarly materials that we've been studying together all year, we may not end up getting to all of your remarks. This project would not have been possible without the endless support of my colleagues on the organizing committee. So I want to take a moment to thank Professors Brian Birch, Nathan Gorlick, and Brianne Matheson for making this idea a reality and seeing it through to its conclusion with me during such strange and difficult times. I'm going to let my co-organizers and then our students introduce themselves briefly now before I tell you a bit about our roundtable participants, and then we kick off the discussion. Brian.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Birch, and I serve as director of the Center for the Study of Ethics here at UVU. And I'm also involved in the Religious Studies program, which, as many here know, sponsors and supports a variety of events related to Mormon studies. It's been a pleasure to work with Lydia and Nate and Bree and others, along with the students on this effort. And I want to thank everyone who's contributed, and most especially our presenters throughout the school year. It's been a very enriching event for everyone involved, so thank you.
I'm Nathan Gorlick. I'm a professor in the English department here at UVU. You'll be hearing enough from me later as I moderate the discussion, so I'll just briefly echo Brian's sentiments in thanking our esteemed participants, as well, by the way, as our fabulous panel of students who have really made what was an uncertain and unusual experiment into what I think most of us agree has been a tremendous success. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
I'm Brianne Matheson, Assistant Professor of English and Literature, and I'm here very quietly and helping to moderate the discussion in the chat, so you likely won't hear a lot from me. But if you've got questions as this rolls on, go ahead and type them in the YouTube chat. I'll port them over here into the Zoom call we're working in so that we can make sure that they get asked in as much as we have time for them. We'll do our best to get to the questions as they're asked. We may not get to all of them. And just as a reminder, we will prioritize the questions of the students who are on the call with us today. This is an engaged learning activity with our students. We're really thrilled for the work that they're doing. I think you'll find them to be really engaged, doing really smart critical work. And so we will prioritize those questions, but if you've got things that have not been answered, get them in the chat and we'll do our best to address them as well. Thanks.
We hear from the students now.
Hi, everybody. I'm Artie. I am a presidential intern in the Office of Inclusion and Diversity. I'm also a research assistant in the Department of Communication here at Utah Valley University. And I'm excited to be here with all of you folks. I'm doing my thesis on Mormonism and feminism.
Hi, my name is Erin Cousins. I'm a junior in the English department here at UVU.
Hello, I'm Sierra Gomez. I'm a senior English student here at UVU.
Hey, my name's Evan. I'm a senior here at UVU in psychology and religious studies, and I'm currently writing my thesis about Gen Z and Mormon apologetics.
Hey everyone, I'm Brody Mitchell. I'm a student at UVU, double majoring in philosophy and anthropology.
All right, and I don't believe Brett has joined us yet, so I'm going to get started with our introductions to our speakers. Our first contributor, Dr. Peter Coviello, is professor of English at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where he specializes in American literature and queer theory. His research considers the entangled histories of empire and intimacy in 19th century America, with particular attention to questions of secularism, biopolitics, and sex. He's the author of Intimacy in America, Dreams of Affiliation in Antebellum Literature, Tomorrow's Parties, Sex and the Untimely in 19th Century America, Long Players, A Love Story in 18 Songs, and most recently, Vineland Reread. He's also written about Phyllis Wheatley, queer children, pop songs, prayer, the history of sexuality, step-parenthood, race and psychoanalysis, polygamy, and more than a few times, Prince. In 2019, his book, Make Yourselves Gods, Mormons and the Unfinished Business of American Secularism appeared from the University of Chicago Press. Our students studied this text together last fall and had the opportunity to discuss it with Dr. Coviello during his presentation titled Barbarism, Heresy and Depravity, Imperial Secularism and the Mormon Dilemma. Next, we have Dr. W. Paul Reeve, who is the Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies in the History Department at the University of Utah, where he teaches courses on Utah history, Mormon history, and the history of the US West. Dr. Reeve is the recipient of several teaching awards and the project manager and general editor of a digital database called The Century of Black Mormons, designed to name and identify all known Black Mormons baptized into the faith between 1830 and 1930. The database is live at centuryofblackmormons.org. His book, Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, was published by Oxford in 2015 and received the Mormon History Association's Best Book Award, the John Whitmer Historical Association's Smith Pettit Best Book Award, and the Utah State Historical Society's Francis Armstrong Madsen Best History Book Award. We also studied this text together last fall, and Dr. Reeve discussed it with us when he presented on A Law Written in the Heart of Our Race, Polygamy, and the Degeneration of Whiteness. Finally, our very own Dr. LaShawn Williams is a licensed clinical social worker and associate professor of social work here in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at UVU. In 2013, she co-founded the Black LDS Legacy Committee to make a safe space for emotional expression and meaningful discussion upon noticing silence from white church members and leadership after the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the killing of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. Earlier this spring, the group held their 4th annual conference on the theme of Black Lives Matter and Eternal Truth. Dr. Williams has published in Dialogue, is a regular contributor to the Rational Faiths blog, and has appeared on Utah Conversations at PBS Utah, as well as Radio West at KUER. In her clinical practice, she uses a relational cultural theory approach. And in her contribution to our speaker series earlier this semester, she brought all of this scholarly and, I would argue, urgently needed experiential expertise to us in her presentation titled The Identity Development of an American Faith, Latter-day Saints, White Supremacy, and Black Lives Matter. The 4th contributor to our series, Dr. Joanna Brooks, is regrettably not with us today. And I want to take a moment to say something about this in the interest of transparency. Our students studied Dr. Brooks's recent book, Mormonism and White Supremacy, and discussed it with her a few weeks ago during her presentation titled Innocent as Donny Osmond, Thinking Through Mormon Conceptions of Sin and White Supremacy. Unfortunately, however, Dr. Brooks declined to participate in today's discussion due to what she views as an unacceptable review of her book by another roundtable participant. Needless to say, we were disappointed by her decision and her reasoning. In short, we do not share Dr. Brooks's supposition that keeping silent here is to our students' benefit or to the greater advantage of racial justice or an exercise of professional scholarly ethics. In fact, we believe that to maintain one's innocence by refusing to participate in the sometimes messy work that is the politics of inquiry is not ethically viable and represents an abdication rather than a realization of scholarly responsibility. So we therefore have determined that Dr. Brooks's book, as well as her withdrawal from the conversation, remain appropriate subjects for discussion without, however, dominating our attention today. I'll now turn the floor over to Nathan Gorlick, who will be moderating our discussion.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you all for being here. We've got a number of, a really diverse set of questions touching on a variety of challenging topics that traverse all three of your presentations, as well as your, from earlier in the year, as well as your ongoing work on the topic of Mormonism and whiteness and related subjects and themes. So I am going to ask that Sierra Gomez kick us off with a question that I think speaks more generally to the potential commonalities across the differences in your individual presentations and your scholarly methodologies. Sierra, if you would, please.
Yeah, of course. So this is a little bit of a broader question to start us off. In each of your research, writing, and presentations for this series and about this topic, each of you interpret Mormon doctrine or theology to some extent as resistant to or supportive of whiteness and white supremacy. Could you tell us about your approach to understanding these versus other types of texts, and also about your perspective on religious studies in general as a site for anti-racist work?
Would any one of the three of you like to jump in, or should I call on you directly?
I think you should start by calling on us. That's what I feel like.
All right, well, then we'll start with you, Peter.
Well, first of all, yes, exactly. Sure. Thank you for that question, and again, thank you to everyone, and especially to Professor Reeve and Professor Williams. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. That's a great question, and the first thing I'll say is sort of a cop-out, which is that I'm, in certain respects, not the right person to ask about the effectivity of, say, religious studies as a discipline in respect to the question of white supremacy, in part because I'm not a religious studies scholar, and I'm not even a religious historian, and I'm sort of an outlier to the field of Mormon studies, which I came to through thinking about the 19th century and queer theory. Exculpatory caveat aside, I will say that for me, an aspect of religious studies, which was thinking about what secularism is and thinking about the interweaving of the project of secularism with the project of imperial modernity, with sort of Christianity's imperial seizure of the globe, was super useful for producing an analytic vocabulary with which to describe how things like religion and racial violence and the seizure of lands and persons might go together or might be thought together. And that, for me, was just tremendous. Like, I can't even tell you, like, tremendously unlocking, reading people like Talal Asad and Sabu Mahmood and other people. And that made the Mormon story vivid to me in ways that it hadn't been before, and made the centuries-long question of white supremacism come into a new focus. So that would be my again, very somewhat in this way rather narrow and particular answer.
It's a good answer. I was going to ask as a follow-up in response to your caveat, well, you wrote a book about secularism, and so it seems that the question of religion and religious studies would be important here. Dr. Williams, you discussed the very same history that concerns Peter's book, but you did so from a decidedly different angle. Can you speak a little bit to Sierra's question about planting anti-racist work in religious studies and the study of Mormonism in general, perhaps also in relation to, or by cutting a fine distinction between what you're doing and the questions of secularism that Professor Coviello is dealing with?
Yes, I can. First, I want to say thank you all so much for continuing to have this conversation. I would be remiss if I didn't give Paul Reeve a shout out, because I feel like a lot of my introduction to the work around Mormon studies and religious scholarship comes from personal invitations and personal relationships, even though I push back on Paul and a couple of my other colleagues regularly. Like, this is part of the work that we do together. So Paul, I don't think I've ever said it publicly, but thank you, for making space and bringing me along with you in these conversations matters. And I want to make sure people are aware that we're all in this work together of trying to move conversations forward. And of course, within the faith, trying to move the gospel forward. So the way that I come to this conversation around this idea of resistance and support, not resistance or, but resistance and support of whiteness and white supremacy, is because I live on the margins of what it means to be Mormon in the US. I think we've got some really poignant, current, like within 24 to 48 hours types of conversations that can talk about what it means to be put on the outside of a group, and what it means to work from the margins to the center. So for me and for the members of the Black LDS Legacy Committee, a lot of what led us to do some of this grassroots work was seeing that our gospel walks and our racial and ethnic walks as Black people were starting to have these diverging experiences, and we were working to create convergence. And so within that, we've always had to have the starting point of our Blackness as the place that let us walk into our Mormonness. And so for many Black people and Black communities, when we start talking about this, and then specifically talking about the history of what it means to be Mormon and what it means to be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the United States, for so many of us, it can't be discussed without, or it can't be discussed separate from the history of the United States. And so for a lot of us, recognizing this minority status of a religious cultural group that is the Mormons, and then understanding its proximity to and connection with other minoritized and marginalized groups, a lot of our conversation and our contributions has been about bringing that marginalized history to the center and the forefront of the present mainstream identity of Mormonism as white. And so I think particularly with books like Paul's, but even with additional discussions around race and racism, with the policy that banned priesthood and temple ordinance participation, we don't have the luxury of looking at the Mormon Church as an either or thing, because compassion and the ability to create connection demand that we look at the Mormon experience of being mongrelized and racialized and marginalized and, sought to be exterminated and to be removed and to be pushed out from the margins or pushed out from the center of white religionism. We are moved to look at that with compassion, as well as with a little bit of hope that there's still this seed of marginalization that rests at the heart of every single person connected to the Mormon faith. And so for me, looking at the racial identity development of an American faith is looking at its whiteness just as much as I've had to look at its marginalization or its minoritized identity, and hoping that both still exist in one, if that makes sense. Like, I'm still hoping as a member of many marginalized communities that there's that piece that always kind of lights the fire within Mormon identity, and it's couched now within these ideas of religious freedom. But you will notice that whenever it comes to conversations that are politicized around religious freedom, there will be roads that my Mormonism takes, which is very conservative, and then kind of always it plays to this side, which supports things around family planning, marriage, relationships, etc. But there's also this part that says space is sacred and freedom to worship is important. And you will see Mormons who are the first ones to step up and to defend the mosque and to defend the synagogues and to say these things matter and these people matter, because we have that double consciousness and that dual identity that I don't see discussed as much from my white historian Mormon scholars friends as I do from my Mormons of color who know that we actively walk this double consciousness. So we have to speak to what we see, which is these are the times that we see our Mormonness resistant to white supremacy. These are the times that we see our Mormonness sell out to white supremacy. And we are committed to, forced to have those conversations because of the integrity that we see at the heart of the gospel, which is to be revelatory and to bring the world his truth, quote unquote. That's where we have to choose to stand in order to choose to stay. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes sense. There's so much there, and I hope we have an opportunity to unpack some of that as we move on. But in the interest of bringing one of the, let's say, characters you were just interpolating into the conversation, Professor Reeve, you're a historian. You consider yourself a historian. That is the discipline in which you work. First of all, do you view yourself as operating within the field of religious studies? And do you view your work as contributing to what Sierra is asking about in terms of anti-racist scholarship, pedagogy, or activism? How do you situate yourself in terms of that question and in terms of what our other two respondents have done in situating themselves there?
Sure. Yeah. So let me try to get at Sierra's question, but also let me also say thank you to UVU and thank you to Peter and LaShawn for this opportunity to be on this panel with you and to learn from you. So as I thought about the question, Sierra, how did I come to my study of whiteness? So there's sort of this scholarship around whiteness that is grounded more in history than religious studies. And I am a historian. I dabble somewhat in religious studies, right? I hope there's crossover in my scholarship, and that to answer the last part of your question, perhaps first, Nathan, yeah, for sure. I hope that the scholarship is useful in pushing back against white supremacy, that it's seen as anti-racist, that it helps to educate us on the power of whiteness, both in the nation as the United States, right, but also within the LDS faith. Because when we talk about, I think, the Latter-day Saint racial story, it's not a problem of the minority groups within the LDS faith. The Latter-day Saint racial story is a problem of whiteness, and the superior, the strength and the power of whiteness, right? That's how I came to understand the story. So my introduction was largely through the existing whiteness historiography. And that historiography tended to center around immigration and labor. And there are some notable exceptions that I found really quite compelling. And I'll just single out Eric Goldstein's book, The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity. Now, there's still an immigration aspect to that story, but it also then blends with religion and the price of whiteness. I came to really understand that whiteness cost Mormonism a significant debt that Mormonism is still struggling to pay off. And so that was a really important influence in terms of my approach to the study of the Latter-day Saint faith and race. So in terms of religious studies, I think religious studies is including some of this whiteness. I'm not up to speed on all that's going on in religious studies. Religious history certainly is grappling with this. There's more and more scholarship coming out about it. Studies about evangelical whiteness following the Civil War and how evangelicals sort of played a role in the Reconstruction period, right? And the reassertion of white supremacy at the end of the Civil War. All of that, I think, is really important context for the Latter-day Saint experience. And so, I think whiteness comes from, for me, an immigration and labor. That's the route that I took to it. But I think there are all kinds of important contributions in religious studies, and especially within the study of the various religious traditions that trace their roots to Joseph Smith. Still a lot to unpack there. And explicitly, I hope that it is anti-racist. And I don't know, Sierra, if your question also dealt with, religious text, but I think, the Latter-day Saint faith tradition needs to engage those religious texts with whiteness and race in mind. And I think we're only just beginning that adventure. If I can use that word, maybe optimistically. I think there's some of that going on in, Fatima Sellah's and Margaret Olson Hemming's Book of Mormon, for the least of these, is a foundational example, but a lot more to do. And Darius Gray and Marvin Perkins have done a lot of work there. But the institution itself needs to start recognizing that its scriptures, you can guarantee no matter what book of scripture the institution is studying in a given year, there's going to be a lesson on obedience. And these are all just sort of interchangeable principle-based lessons. And why isn't there a lesson on race guaranteed every, book of scripture? And the institution itself, it's just, I think, blind to those kind of things. And so those are ways that I think religious studies can help to inform what's going on in terms of race and Mormonism.
Thank you very much for that. And in fact, I'm going to do my best to get all three of you to speak to one another as our conversation proceeds. But I think this is a good sort of introductory foray that sets up some of the terms of that conversation. And so in the interest of carrying that conversation further, I'm going to ask about the elephant in the room, so to speak, that I think, Professor Reeve, your remarks about immigration, labor, and also the question of double consciousness that you raised, Professor Williams, sort of points to, which is really the subject, if I may, of your whole book, Professor Coviello. To quote two of the other great paragons of double consciousness, Salt and Pepper, let's talk about sex, baby. Because it seems to me that whenever we're dealing with the question of immigration, labor, identification with a given nationhood, a nation state, an in-group or an out-group, we're talking always implicitly or explicitly about the politics of racial purity. And their questions of sex, in terms, not just in terms of gender identification and gender roles, but sexuality and sexual desires are right on the surface, which perhaps, Professor Reeve, is why it's hard to imagine a conversation about that at the next general conference, though I wouldn't, mean to foreclose its possibility. So with that in mind, we do have a question that sort of scaffolds this portion of the conversation for us. I'm going to ask Evan to jump in and lead the way here.
Right. So as we were getting ready for the roundtable today, our conversation kind of turned to the intersection of race, sex, and gender. And we noticed that the topic of interracial relationships had not yet come up in our discussions with any of you. And so for context, President Nelson, the prophet of the LDS, current prophet of the LDS Church, said in 1995, so as recently as 1995, he was warning against interracial marriage while he was an apostle. And one current church manual, the Eternal Marriage Student Manual, that is still on the church's website as the current manual, says, quote, because of this, we recommend that people marry those who are of the same racial background generally and of somewhat the same economic and social and educational background. Some of these are not an absolute necessity, but preferred, and above all, the same religious background without question. Could you talk about the church's past or current imbrications with politicization of intermarriage in the US from the perspective of your respective academic areas of interest?
Or maybe just, from the perspective of your approaches to the question at hand, question of Mormonism and whiteness.
My short answer is yes, I can. I could probably sort of bore you tremendously by going on a great length. I want to say that I just so much appreciate, particularly what Professor Williams said about what struck me as a non-Mormon and as a scholar of the 19th century researching it was this profound and unresolved doubleness in early Mormonism, which would express itself as a simultaneous opposition to the imperial United States, which was persecuting them unjustly, just as it did the native peoples, and then an overpowering identification with the imperial United States as against, say, the native people whose land they wanted. And of course, for me, sex was a tremendous leverage point for all of this, because as I will surprise none of you when I say this, the Mormons, as you know, in the 19th century were regarded as sexual deviants and were indeed racialized as sexual deviants because of their deviant sex practices that were polygamy, right? So they know firsthand, and from before they leave the East Coast, they know what the racialization of sexual practice is like and what it means. And so much of the first 50 years of the faith, or the first 60 years of the faith, which is really all I know about, is about sort of trying to manage that racialization. And that cuts in a number of different, just as Professor Williams said quite precisely, it cuts in a number of different ways at once, so that there are terrible legacies of what Jared Hickman calls deplorable theological racism, just as there are also legacies of profound upheaval and sort of passionate work as against the racial state. And that's all of it, I think, is leveraged very much by sex. On the point of which I want to say, it behooves me to say, I just found out right before we sat down today that Professor Michael Quinn has died, which I don't know if any of you know. He's not a person I ever met, but his work in relation to Mormonism and sexuality was tremendously important to me, and strikes me as having been extremely brave and extremely forward thinking. So I would follow up that question, for which I thank you, by just offering rest and peace to Michael Quinn, whose work meant a lot to many of us.
Thank you so much. I was not aware of that. And I think, invoking his name here at this event is, I hope, a worthy tribute to his contributions. Let me just recover from that for just a moment and rewind to your emphasis on the first 50 years of the faith being really sort of occupied with the core problem of policing the limit between racism, or an inchoate development of race and racial identification, and sex and sexuality. This is a question that you raised, as I recall, in the YouTube chat some months back in response to Professor Reeve's presentation back then. And I would like maybe to take a moment here to turn the conversation toward Dr. Reeve. Would you say a little bit more about the place of sexuality and the politics of racial purity in your work, and perhaps how you see it dovetailing with, or in even more entertaining ways, distinguishing itself from Professor Coviello's?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, as a historian, I was just interested in the ways that the nation was grappling with this at the very moment that this new religious tradition is born, and unsurprisingly, obviously these racial attitudes play out in theological ways amongst the Latter-day Saints. But I think they also teach us something about the ways that the Latter-day Saints attempted to use theology to understand race. And, so you have in my book, I look at a couple of chapters on red, white, and Mormon. And, you have the Latter-day Saints who are suggesting that intermarriage amongst Native Americans is a good thing. That, in other words, sex with Native Americans helps to create a white and delightsome group of people. It will bring them, Latter-day Saints suggest that intermarriage amongst Native Americans will bring Native Americans with the white Latter-day Saints on their journey towards whiteness. And then you have Latter-day Saints who suggest that you should not intermarry or have sex with people of Black African descent, because that will bring the curse upon you, right? And it will prohibit priesthood from future generations. Those directions of interracial relationships play out very differently. Utah never passes a law prohibiting white Native American relations. Other Western states do. But Utah prohibits Black-white relationships and white Asian relationships. Sort of late, 1888, and sort of following in the lead of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and sort of adopting similar provisions that other Western states were adopting at the time. Theologically, they don't. Latter-day Saints don't have, the same kind of racial curse towards people of Asian descent in terms of these racial relationships. And then the other thing that I would just point out is that I think really fear of race mixing is at the heart of Brigham Young's shift from an open racial vision to segregated priesthood and temples. And, he comes to learn about interracial marriage in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch, as well as William McCary, who starts his own schismatic group based upon the sexualized ceiling of white women to him in winter quarters. And those two things seem to set Brigham Young off. But the interesting thing is, we can see a difference in terms of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young's theological views about race. But Joseph Smith also speaks out against race mixing. It's the one constant through the entire thread, all the way up through the 20th century. The vast majority of Latter-day Saint leaders, even though it softens in the 20th century to be more about, people from different cultures who marry might struggle in their marriage in a way that, you don't need to bring that burden upon the marriage, rather than simply allowing love to figure these things out, right? So there is a bit of softening in the 20th century, but nonetheless, as has been mentioned, right, I think it's a one constant stream that you don't see the changes over time with. It's just always there in the background, this fear of race mixing. And I think it maps onto Latter-day Saint notions of Israelite identity, not marrying with Old Testament prescriptions against Israelites, intermarrying amongst other peoples, and Latter-day Saints see themselves as a reification of ancient Israel, and therefore they imbibe sort of the surrounding cultural attitudes about race mixing, but then they add their theological weight to it, and it plays out, I think, in those kind of ways. You add on how outsiders imagine Mormon polygamy just being all about mixing of the races, right? And it's a recipe ripe for just trying to control race mixing and interracial sex.
Well, a fantastically comprehensive response. And I so very much appreciate not just the information that you're presenting, but the way you organize that information. Your book is a masterclass, I think, in how to put a narrative together by way of a sort of single cultural artifact, in this case, a racist cartoon about polygamy that reveals all of the sort of intersecting and underlying anxieties surrounding racial intermixing, surrounding the incoherence, the inherent incoherence of the very concept of race because of the ways in which sexual desire doesn't care about those limits, or it certainly is not restrained by them. If I may, however, it sounds that your response strikes me as the response on behalf of the dominant Mormon group in Utah in the 19th century, which is white people. And, I follow what you say, for instance, when you say that it's clear that these early Latter-day Saints are using theology to understand race. But I wonder, Professor Williams, if it might not also be the case that they were using race to understand theology, and whether and how this bears upon your engagement with that same history, as you say, from the margins, as somebody who might be somewhat differently invested in that narrative and its coherences or incoherences, or the anxieties and energies built into maintaining it, even in a repressed form.
Whew. Okay. I just have a few things that I want to add to this conversation, just for consideration. One, I mean, we can start as recently and we can start as, antiquated as we might like. But when you think about the history of the United States, and you think about how often sex was used in conquest through the enslavement of Black and Indigenous people, there were never any rules or bounds against sex in between races when it was meant to breed, or when it was meant to be violent or to be dominant and to assert one's position of power over the marginalized group. So many Indigenous women being raped, so many Hispanic and Mexican women, and the immigration and the borders being raped as an act of war, so many Black women being raped and bred through enslavement. So at what point in time did it turn to, we need to have laws against you actually wanting to do this versus you feeling like you need to do this in order to assert your dominance as a world superpower, as a white man, as white power in that sense? So when you're looking at just the history of sex and how it's used as a tool of violence in the creation of this country because of enslavement, because of genocide, et cetera, then you move into and through the Civil War. Let's, remove any of Joseph Smith's prophecies and whatnot about the Civil War and about it being slavery, put all that aside. Once you move through the Civil War, you move through the Mormons, days of 47, coming in to Utah, you come into the early 1900s and you have D.W. Griffith's movie, The Birth of a Nation, which was its own silent film and its own political propaganda about the expansion and the expressions of Black sexuality. And so what you have is this marginalized religious group trying to figure out, where do we fit in? And so again, that seeking of safety within white supremacy through something like Birth of a Nation then plays into the survival techniques of this religious group, this religious cultural group in the US. How do we maintain our safety? It's fine to enslave and it's fine to breed, but it's not okay to humanize and to marry and to care for, right? So that's our 16, 17, 18, early 1900s. What I wanted to contribute to this conversation, specifically to the question and the quotes that were used as outlined, is the experiences of folks that I see in my clinical practice who are young LDS couples that are interracially dating and are looking towards marriage. And it is the women and the men of color in these relationships who find themselves in my office wondering, how do I survive the family that I'm marrying into? My own experiences growing up in the church and being counseled and cautioned against dating interracially. I grew up in the American South. I'm from North Carolina, and I have had Spencer W. Kimball's words read to me. You know what the prophet says about dating interracially? I was 16. One of the demographics about membership within this church is that it's based on where you live and who you live around. So when you are in an area like North Carolina and the church is still predominantly white, my ward, my congregation was predominantly white. My options for dating and for marriage and for checking all of the boxes to allow me to have safety and to be valid and legitimate within church culture meant that I was looking at potentially dating mostly white men. However, whenever there was a young brother that came to investigate the church, I promise you, most times he wasn't looking for me, and that's okay. Maybe I wasn't looking for him either. However, people wanted to bring us together. LaShawn, have you met? Insert brother's name here. And I'm like, no, I haven't. I think you all should get together. Then we get together and we're talking about who we're actually interested in, which is not each other, right? So even just, 20 or so years ago, right, when I was young and dating and whatnot, my options were, ones that I was actually counseled against. So the question then became, in order to survive and to fit in and to continue to find ways to legitimize and make sure that I was worthy to be seen as a woman in the church, not just as a woman, but as a good woman, as a woman who wanted to be a stay-at-home mother, right, who was able to fit into all of the boxes, then my only options for marriage were interracial most of the time. So then I end up becoming the fulfillment of the quote in the manual. Because of this, we recommend that people marry those who are of the same racial background generally and of somewhat the same economic and social and educational background. Some of those are not an absolute necessity, but preferred, and above all, the same religious background without question. In spite of the most favorable matings, the evil one still takes a monumental toll and is the cause for many broken homes and frustrated lives. So as a divorced woman from an interracial marriage with 3 ethnically mixed children, do I not fulfill this prophetic warning? And if I do, what becomes the conversation? If you ask and you explore what it means and what actually played out in my relationship, would you say that it was white supremacy, LaShawn? You know, I would. And this is where it gets funky, this is where it gets messy, and this is where it still gets rigorous. Because if we're going to have conversations about the way that race plays into our relationships within the church, we've got to be able to understand that the savior mentality that we seem to have with one another, whether I'm saving someone because they are less active in the church, and by marrying me, they're going to become more active, I'm going to bring them back to church, or I'm marrying someone outside of my racial group, generally from dominant to subordinate, because I'm going to save them from the cultural background from which they come, which is usually white to people of color. There's this saving piece that I think is part and parcel of our identity within this faith, is that we see ourselves as saving and bringing people into the fold. And yet, what is the fold in which we're bringing people into? Did I marry into a racist family? Did I marry a racist person? Did the impact of having children with a Black woman affect my marriage and my relationships? In ways it did. Before I had children, I remember speaking with my ex-husband about how he felt about us raising kids. And before they were born, he said, you know, they're going to come here and they might have some difficulties because of how they experience prejudice, but we're going to support them and we're going to encourage them, and they're going to be successful because we want them to be successful. They are loved, they are cared for, everything that you want a parent to say, right? And then my children came out very white presenting. And those conversations were fewer and fewer because I believe in that moment, my husband felt safe because he did not have to become a champion for race or racism because of how his children looked. And so now as politics and personality and identity politics have divided a lot of us, I'm raising children with someone that, you know, if you were to look at different examples and definitions of what it means to support white supremacy, you would find them in some of our interactions. And one of the things that I think humanizes this conversation so much is the resistance and the hesitancy that I have to even say that out loud. Because who wants to say someone so intimately connected to me is part of or benefits from or is blind to, as you said, Dr. Reeve, a system of white supremacy to the point that it destroyed our relationship. So these things are not just quotes in a manual. These are lived experiences of people. I can tell you that at least 5 of my current caseload in my life are people of color wondering, am I going to lose myself if I marry into this family? You know, they voted for so-and-so, and I just don't know if politically we can get along. Or I didn't think it was that bad, but now it is. How am I going to raise kids? They're having questions, and they're having questions about what our kids are going to look like and how they're going to identify. They don't want my kids to identify as Black. Like, this is not a citation. These are people's lived experiences right now. These are conversations that we can and should be having with our missionaries when they go out to proselyte and fall in love and then come back and want to go back and rescue and save and bring home, right? These are lived experiences, and they're also intellectual exercises. And so I don't apologize for bringing in my personal story, because I need people to understand that this is not just something that we pontificate about or that we philosophize about. These are lived experiences of real people who are trying desperately to make these things matter, to make these things match, to make these things mesh so that they can feel whole. I hope that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And I have to say, there is at least one conspicuously absent potential member of this panel who might need to hear that as much as the rest of us. But I want to give Professor Coviello an opportunity to reply.
Just want to say, like, that's just it's a pleasure to be speaking to both of you. One of the things I will say along with Professor Williams about like, so listen, again, I've said to you before, I'm not a Mormon, I'm not a member of the faith, but I've been speaking about Mormonism and the Mormon, and particularly the sects in the 19th century for a long time. And there are virtually no places I have spoken where I haven't encountered just a queer kid in the audience looking at me very directly, for whom none of this is especially abstract. You know what I'm saying? Like none of either the queerness with which the Mormons were described or sort of brushed in the 19th century, nor the after effect of that, which has been a lot of disavowal, like to the degree that the Mormons were understood as queer people, and because of that racialized in the 19th century. To that degree, they've produced a tremendous disavowal, which is how I would just amplify again what Professor Williams was saying, following from Professor Reeve, that racial purity is for all the reasons I think Professor Reeve says part of it, but part of it too is just forcibly identifying with whiteness as against having been identified as insufficiently white, as counterfeit in one's whiteness, and made counterfeit through precisely sex practice. Another, and we could talk at a whole other way, another way that the 19th century Mormons did this was through gender distinctions. Yes, we look like the native peoples in some ways because we want to assimilate them, and they're in our scripture, and they too are not organized by dyadic monogamy, but we, unlike them, believe in gendered hierarchy. We believe in that with great vigor. And over the course of the 19th century, we're going to believe in it more forcefully, as though this would anchor a hard distinction between the socialities of the Mormons and those of, say, the native peoples. So this is just to say, I feel I'm only repeating what these other two more capable scholars have said, but like the liveness of these seemingly esoteric 19th century questions is not lost on so many populations that a non-Mormon just giving talks, have encountered very directly. You know?
Yeah, and I wanted to go there in terms of asking you and Professor Reeve to take this opportunity to step beyond the safe zone of 19th century history and to, give us a sense of how the work you're doing contends with the sort of contemporary realities that Dr. Williams is describing. I mean, of course, you are writing about the 19th century, Professor Coviello, but you're doing so through a variety of contemporary conceptual apparatuses, particularly in terms of queer theory and Foucauldian analysis of history. And Professor Reeve as well, the very concept of race that you so effectively problematize and its social constructedness is not an idea that really catches on until well into the last half of the 20th century. So it's not as though your work can be thought, to my mind, can be thought of as sort of neatly partitioned in the past, as though we were simply observing some objects in a cabinet of historical curiosities. These, as Professor Williams so I think powerfully and movingly makes clear, these are not just ideas that damaged people once upon a time, and this isn't just a matter of historical record. The history is not just something that happened once upon a time. History is, in fact, the structure of the present. And I want to just spin to one of our students, Artie, who had something to contribute in the chat. Artie, I hope you won't mind just reading or summarizing what you had to say there.
Sorry. So yeah, no, I mean, I was only going to comment that I really appreciate the conversation that we're having and what Dr. Williams really brings into it, which is basically what you had already just mentioned. Because I think that one issue that I'm seeing, with this academic conversation that we have is that a lot of the time, not everybody within has the privilege to, to be a voyeur and to be a bystander, but, are living these experiences. I don't know if this is like a good time to ask, one of the follow-up questions I had, but, because of so much of it is really grounded in our lived subjectivities, framing really the modern or the contemporary experience within Mormonism, like, is there room for like just one interpretation of doctrine? I think that, all of you had mentioned, we had mentioned kind of the interpretation of the spiritual texts. And I think it's interesting that, in the same religion that there's, the ordained women movement really looking for equal rights, to be able to hold the priesthood as people like the Deseret nationalists, and where does the church side with, what, who do they support, and is there ever going to be a space for like a single unified, one interpretation of scripture, or I don't know, how do we make sense of that? Sorry if that's not worded super great.
No, thank you, Artie. I think it's very effectively worded, and I would, just suggest to put a finer point on this question, that it seems that the title of this speaker series is Mormonism and the Challenges of Whiteness. It is not the Contemporary Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Challenges of Whiteness. And all of these different, sometimes competing, overlapping, overdetermined histories of the word Mormon or Mormonism suggest that this is not a unifying signifier that names a particular entity or group of people, that there is no sort of absolute conformity that could even be expected here. So just to maybe put a finer point on what is already a perfectly fine question from Artie, how do we think through this complex, complicated, contradictory term, which is supposed to be the heading under which all of these different conceptions, contemporary or historical, are circulating? Maybe if you don't mind, Dr. Williams, could we begin with you this time?
I just finished running my mouth. So this is like the big tent question, yes? Like, how are we all supposed to fit, or what is the one thing we're supposed to unite around? I think what always comes back to me is the words from Joseph Smith, like, give them correct principles and let them govern themselves. And with that tied into, which is at the 10th article of faith, that we believe in being subject to kings, princes, and principles and all that kind of stuff, governments and whatnot. I think we anticipated, I don't think we anticipated having to survive the way that we did. I think that there is a very cool potential subversive quality to being connected with the faith because of its ability to maneuver. And I don't know that there is going to ever be one interpretation that isn't at other times canceled out by another interpretation. I have heard it said that one of our leaders, when asked, why are so many members of the church Republican, having just come visiting from a place down in South America, said, oh, we're all Republican? I thought we were all socialists, talking more to the global nature of the Latter-day Saint faith. And so I think a lot of people would love to see that leadership come from the top and be more expansive, and to say, hey, even though we all are in leadership because we seem to know each other or be connected to each other or live near each other all along the Wasatch Front, we really do believe in and support the perspectives of what it means to be a global institution. For that reason, I believe that there is a lot of room. However, our practices don't seem to support the belief that we say we have, because there's this request that when you join the faith, while it says bring the best of what you have with you, there's still an expectation that you're going to fit into a certain way of being. And so as long as that continues to exist, I think we'll be involved in a lot of doublespeak. We're saying one thing, but then we're also doing another. Is it possible? I do believe that it's possible, but I think it's going to require a number of shifts within how we approach and expand our theology.
Now, I do want to give our other respondents an opportunity to speak to this question, but I'm hoping maybe we could reiterate it in slightly different terms. In the chat over here on Zoom, Artie is suggesting, my question might be if it's possible to ever separate the interpretation from white supremacy. And here we have already prepared a rather extensive question along these lines by our student, Aaron. So Aaron, if you wouldn't mind jumping in and getting us going here.
Yeah, of course. All right. In one of my classes this semester, we discussed the idea of retrofitting structures in order to grant more access to the people who were excluded in the original designs. In the context of disability studies, retrofitting is seen as a well-intentioned but after the fact and therefore separate but equal remedy. I wonder if the public relations programming that the Mormons used to change their image to reflect patriotic, wholesome white American values, as well as the revelation that rescinded the ban on Black men holding the priesthood and the more recent pronouncements against racism. I wonder if all of those can be seen as retrofitting actions that came about due to criticism. To what extent do you feel the church can only ever be retrofit due to its being originally designed by and for white men? Would it need to be structurally redesigned in order to be seen as fully welcoming and safe for all potential members? And then this analogy could also be very easily applied to other structurally unsound systems too, such as policing, voting, healthcare, or even higher education. So please let us know if you have any productive connections to current conversations taking place in these institutions as well.
Thank you, Erin. Since we are on the subject of retrofitting, which involves sort of imposing upon what's already there, maybe Professor Reeve, you could kick us off here.
Yeah, sure. So let me just say thanks to Dr. Coviello and Dr. Williams for that last segment, really profound, and you know, especially the connection to the real life. I really appreciate that. So, you know, my thoughts on this, sort of mulling this over. So sort of going back to Artie's question, but also sort of combining that with Erin's question, maybe. I see Mormonism as at once hierarchical and democratic. And if we only think of it as hierarchical, then you're sort of stuck hoping that old white men at the top are going to respond to some of the things that we've been talking about. But you also have to capture the democratic element of it. Kathleen Flake, a religious studies scholar at University of Virginia, I think most famously said, Joseph Smith is the Henry Ford of Revelation. He wants everyone to have one. And I think that's a pretty profound aspect of Mormonism that's baked in from the very beginning. Certainly one person can have revelation for the entire church community, but every person is expected to receive revelation for themselves. And those democratic elements, I think, are what Latter-day Saints in the pew who are engaged in issues of racial justice in the present need to tap into. I know it can be challenging and difficult work, but Latter-day Saints, if they're sort of waiting around for the hierarchy to sort of respond, sometimes my sense is might be waiting for quite some time. I think there are things that things that Dr. Williams is already engaged in, and I'm just thinking of the annual conference that she directs as one example, right? But I was invited by a stake in London organized by the Stake Relief Society Presidency, the female organization at the stake level, for a workshop, and they full-on confronted racial issues in their stake. I was just asked to provide the historical component. They had other panelists who were sharing their personal experiences, the way that this impacted their lives. They aren't waiting for direction from the top to do that. They're pulling that off themselves. And I think there are ways that the Latter-day Saint tradition, once again, responding to that revelation that is available to everyone, can match and meet the moment that we're in. My sense is that the institution also needs to take accountability, and that requires owning its racial past. My sense is that, to get at maybe Artie's question, but also Erin's question, I think the Latter-day Saint scriptural tradition includes all kinds of profound racial justice notions that we have just absolutely neglected because we hobble ourselves because of our own racial history. And rather than confronting it and acknowledging it, instead of denying and trying to sidestep it, in owning it, we can stand in places of empathy. We both participated in racism and hopefully have come to understand its consequences. We experienced at least soft versions of racism. What better people to stand in places of empathy in the 21st century and lead out in notions of racial justice than Latter-day Saints. And, you know, getting at, Aaron, your question, I don't think you have to retrofit anything. It's there from the foundation. Jesus says, if you take notions of Smith's claims to revelation seriously, he says to him in 1830, I am no respecter of persons and I claim all flesh as my own. What if Latter-day Saints use that as their calling card, right? Like, we claim all flesh as our own. We follow the example. They have this profound doctrine of all people are children of heavenly parents. In other words, the heavenly parents in Latter-day Saint theology are parents to multiracial families. And they're all equal, right? In Latter-day Saint theology, not in practice. I'm not suggesting at all, like Dr. Williams has already, you know, pointed to, right? All kinds of problems in terms of implementing this, but I don't think that Latter-day Saints have yet to even tap into the profound nature of, you know, its founding universal principles. Smith claims 4 revelations that he says this gospel message is to be preached unto every creature. 4 different times, every creature. Latter-day Saints like to quote every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Every creature leaves no one out. And those original Latter-day Saints, at least some of them seem to take that seriously, right? They are baptizing people of Black African descent. They're sending missionaries to Jamaica in 1853. You know, it's the power of whiteness sort of overwhelms all of that. I don't think we have to retrofit anything. We just have to understand you know, the theology that was laid from the beginning and capture it and unleash its power. And, you know, my frustration is the leadership is yet to, I think, do that. And therefore, I think that's the democratic part of things where people in the pews, at least some, are engaging in this.
Now, we assume that the leadership of the church is watching this event on YouTube right now. So hi there, leaders. Now, I want to turn in relation to what you were just saying, Professor Reeve, back to what Professor Coviello, particularly when it comes to this question of accountability and the notion of foundations, because Aaron's question seems to be, look, we've been following this history for a while now, and it's difficult to separate the deliberate history of the church's development, including through a variety of divinely authorized revelations, from the development of white supremacy. In fact, for instance, as everybody here, I think, knows, in 1978, there was a revelation which finally withdrew the prohibition against Black people being participants in the church, Black men in particular being able to access the priesthood. But revelations go in both directions, of course. Not every revelation is a progressive one, and not all democracies move according to the arc of history that bends toward justice. That much is terrifyingly patent in the context of our own contemporary American democratic, let's call it a moment and not a crisis. So that this democratic revelatory aspect of the religion represents, as I think you are right to say, Professor Reeve, a promise and an opportunity, but also a problem. Because if, you know, there is a revelation, well, now in 1978, you know, Black men can now hold the priesthood, because everybody is authorized and expected to have a revelation, somebody else can say, I had a different revelation. And I don't think that even if the leadership says so, I should have to live next door to somebody who looks different than I do. So, Professor Coviello, you also have taken a deep dive into some of these really sonorous and inspirational moments in the Mormon archive, some of the same references that Professor Reeve was mentioning here. Can you sort of dive in here and help unfold some of this for us?
Yeah, I will say that I'm going to be uncharacteristically circumspect, because I don't really not mean it when I say that I stopped really knowing about Mormonism in about 1896. So it's not, and as a non-Mormon, it doesn't seem to be exactly my place to talk about the 20th century and the 21st century, about which I know so little. I will say this, though, and it just is going to repeat what Professor Reeve said, which is that in the book, I try to suggest neither that there was some pure originary Mormonism that, say, Brigham Young, by so forcibly identifying with national whiteness as a gambit to save the Mormons from extinction, perverted. I don't think that's right. Nor do I think what Mormonism in its initial creation was just destined for its white supremacist 19th century. Neither of those things seem to me the case. There were just, as Professor Reeve said, a multitude of elements internal to Mormon theology that could be mobilized in different ways for different purposes at different moments. And I was, as you saw me, just filled with delight at what Professor Reeve said, was that in lots of ways, those potentialities have only just begun to be addressed, have only begun to be imagined. I think of my own work on the Book of Mormon itself, which follows from the work of the very, very, very great scholar Jared Hickman, through whom I get all of this stuff, who reminds us that the Book of Mormon itself seems, or it can make itself read very easily as a tremendous, thundering indictment of white supremacist imperialism that the Nephites just can't recognize in themselves. They just can't understand themselves as anything other than God's favorites. And for this misapprehension, they are duly punished. You know what I mean? And I think, again, I would see Professor Hickman here. So that's only a way of saying, like, I have less purchase than probably everyone in the room about the fugitive inner dynamics of 21st century Mormonism. But I can only vigorously agree with what Professor Reeve has just said, that there is much to be mobilized in the archive of Mormonism that was itself taken up and moved in directions that can be objected to, that can be repurposed. Not to say, with Professor Williams, not to say that that's easy. Like, we live inside the terms of the world, and imagining outside of those terms is hard. Like, the world gives us the terms in which to think. That's hard. That makes thinking and practicing a difficult exercise. But again, I'll just say with Professor Reeve, the archive itself seems to be tremendously rich, both like textually and historically. So that's my, I don't know if that's optimistic or not optimistic, but I am in great concurrence with my colleagues on this.
Fabulous, thank you. I think it is sensibly complicated. And this is reminding us, as what you're referring to via Jared Hickman is a remark that you made during your visit back in October that read simply on the surface, like, what is this book about? The Book of Mormon is, as you say, a sort of intense, vituperative warning against white supremacist imperialism, against manifest destiny, which is also very difficult to reconcile with the history of the Mormons and their participation, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes not, in the history of manifest destiny. Professor Williams, can you jump in here? And I'm sure you've got lots to add. Or I could ask you a more targeted question, which is, I mean, for me, what's
No. Okay, so Paul, I'm going to say this first. I'm going to take you to lunch, okay? And we're going to get over this. We're going to work this part out of our relationship, okay? Let me say this to my friends. What I think is really important to note around this notion of retrofitting, right, is there's a caveat and there's a safeguard, there's a fail-safe built into this idea that we do have these principled archives of our behavior, right, that say that we should be able to do all of these things. Two paths I want to point out. In order to be safe in this life, Mormons were able to become white, heterosexual, cisgendered, wholesome patriots in this life. And it is that thing that, whether we speak it out loud or we just kind of assume or presume it, that's what we extend to all of the other marginalized groups who are also connected to the Latter-day Saint faith. Think about our whatever you want to call it, our philosophy about why people come to the earth differently abled. We market it and we discuss it as a challenge that they will face in this life. And then in the next life, they'll be made whole. Every other marginalized population, whether it is about ability, whether it's about sexual identity, gender expression, racial identity, we are told that these things are challenges that we carry in this life. And in the next life, we will access the purity, the safety, and the whiteness that Mormons access in this life right now. That's the difference for all of this. because we have this ability to feel bad for people who are differently able, the disability community, for the queer community, for Black and brown communities. But you know what? The way that we make it make sense is we say, you know, it's a challenge that you have in this life. In the next one, you'll be just like me. I'm safe now because I'm white. I'm pure, I'm patriotic, I'm cisgendered, I'm heterosexual, I'm able-bodied. I'm safe now. And as my Mormonness, I left that behind to fight and to gather and to garner safety. But you, Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, you people who are disabled, because you were so pure and so holy that God put you in a body that Satan couldn't touch. You're safe from Satan's influence because you were in that body. But when you get to the next life, you're going to be just like me because I'm safe now. I feel like that's the part of the conversation that we're not having. And it's not like a good or a bad conversation, but it's very, very real, because the lived experiences of marginalized people now are then orchestrated and put together in our non-marginalized minds as these are challenges that you all have to bear with now. As a Black person, I have been told more than once that when I get to heaven, I'll be white. So I have to go and I have to learn all these wonderful, amazing lessons about being a Black woman in this body, and then leave all of that behind to turn into a white woman in heaven? All of my queer people, my queer family members that are told that when they get to heaven, they get to now be like me after they had this whole entire lived experience, as if that's the thing that we're trying to get towards. I think we have to be very, very careful about how we talk about this archived notion of being an accepting and open gospel, which I do believe that we are, but I understand that the way that we talk about it still genders it, still makes it binary, still makes it safe now for whiteness, safe later in exaltation for anything that's not white, not heterosexual, not able-bodied, and not whatever else I'm thinking of that's in the majority population. You know what I'm saying? And I don't mean it as any sort of attack or disrespect, but I feel like that's the thing that we have to be also holding in this space and in this conversation, which is safety now, safety eventually. Those are the two major conversations that we're having when we're talking about what it means to be this all-inclusive gospel, is who gets to be safe now, who has to endure to the end and be safe in exaltation later in a completely different bodily experience.
Professor Williams, I just want to say, I'll take back I know a little bit about the 20th century, 21st century, which was researching like, okay, what did 20th century Mormons say to queer people? So I read all of the manuals, and that blew my mind, completely blew my mind. Not just the like, you're having trouble now, but God loves you, God bless, but that in exaltation, you will no longer be queer, which struck me as so profoundly odd in a faith that's not actually about redemption. In my reading of the 19th century, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's actually like you already now, the world itself is radiant with God's presence. It's not fallen and it doesn't need to be redeemed. Coming upon that was very just startling to me. You know what I mean? Like that seemed a big turnabout in what I had understood to be the theological premises of the faith. So I just wanted to add, well, like, as a researcher, yeah, that struck me.
I think you're just still seeing our safety practices in action. Like, we're still trying to figure out what's our safe place. And yes, I love you. Yes, I care about you. But I have to make sense of why you exist and why you're still not safe. I've accessed it because I had access to a couple of things that kind of made me betray our relationship. So the only way that I can see to make sense of it is you guys will get there eventually. We're here now. And like, we just got to kind of keep our own selves safe. I don't know. Paul, what do you think?
No, I completely agree, Dr. Williams, 100%. I mean, you know, my frustration, I mean, my comments were you know, designed to sort of suggest, right, I think there's something there. It's not a retrofit, but I fully agree. The way this plays out in practice is incredibly problematic, and it still reifies the white male, heterosexual, you know, everything that we know, according to demographic studies, the majority of Latter-day Saints globally don't even match, right? So, you know, and until we're cognizant even of that, right? White has always been normal in Latter-day Saints practice. And something that's not white is seen as a deterioration away from white, a curse, all of those kind of things, so that the afterlife is a return to what has always been perceived as normal. And until we can even get Latter-day Saints in the pew to even be cognizant of that, right? Research for Century of Black Mormons has really demonstrated this in the written archive. It sort of just hit me over the head. Going into the Latter-day Saint membership record database, and the institutional church's mantra is always, we have never kept track of membership according to racial categories. And technically that's true. But what we've encountered going into the membership record database is that there's no official category for race on these records, but the missionary or the clerk who's creating a baptismal record for a Black Latter-day Saint can't help but write in the margins. And I would guess 95% of the people we've put in, that are included in the database can't help but write in the margins the word colored or Negro blood. In some sort of way, there's no category for this, but it just reifies the notion that white is normal. White is normal for Latter-day Saints, and what is not white needs to be notated. It's a deterioration away from white. And so I completely agree with what you're saying. Still going to take you up on the lunch, but right there with you, I think that's absolutely 100% right. I just feel like I feel frustrated that we don't even read our scriptures, read sort of, the canon in ways that blow this up, right? And Jared Hickman is a profound example, and I love that Dr. Coviello, is drawing upon that. And I think Fatima Salah's book is another way of doing this. We need to sort of blow up those longstanding assumptions that just reify whiteness until we can start engaging with race in the Latter-day Saint scriptural canon. And find me a revelation from Joseph Smith in the Doctrine and Covenants that gives justification for the racial policies, right? Like, no, instead, if you're reading those verses racially, then it's universal and it's embedded in the foundation. And that's what I was trying to say. We don't got to retrofit anything. It's there. We got to acknowledge it and build a foundation on it. And the institutional church doesn't seem up to the task right now. That's my frustration.
So what do you think, Paul? Because I still hold on to this piece that we are taught to be sympathetic about certain kinds of differences and to say, oh, poor you, pat you on the head. It's okay. Just wait until the afterlife. Then you'll be made whole. It exists for, and as I look at this, it exists for some of the populations that I think we have the most contact with. And I explain it this way because I was talking to a dear friend of mine in one of my wards about race and racism and comparing it to how we were just talking about like the queer populations and how there's like this tension when you've got queer Latter-day Saints saying, we're being treated just like Black people were treated as if it's the thing that we were treated in the past. And she said, well, everybody knows a queer person. And so that's what made it easier for her to find herself aligned with fighting for equality around queer populations. Everyone then also knows a white woman. So then that's why it makes sense for them to be able to fight for ordination of white women to the priesthood. Everyone knows someone who has a disability. And so it's easier for them to say and to see value in that person. But it's this very sympathetic thing. I feel bad for you that this has happened to you in this life. And so I'm going to pray that you can endure and get to the end and then become like me. Like, I still don't feel like we're really addressing that part because there is no sympathy for, I feel so bad that you're Black in this life. That is just that's a difficult thing that's been placed upon you. In the same way that I have heard these conversations happen to queer communities and to folks within the disability community, that it's a thing that has happened to you. And so because it's happened to you, we kind of revere and take a little bit more care of you than we do when it comes to Blackness and brownness. Even within the Book of Mormon text, if you look at it, that is supposed to be about the indigenous in this nation. So how on earth did Black people from continental Africa become the main characters of the curse if that wasn't even supposed to be our story, if the Book of Mormon is based here in pre-colonial Americas? And so that's kind of like two things. So do you understand what I'm saying? Like, we're taught to have sympathy for some diversity because we believe that it's a challenge for now. in ways that we don't have sympathy for ethnic diversity as a challenge, except we do believe that in the next life, then you'll be white and you'll be okay. Does what I'm saying make sense? Because I don't understand how we have that conversation, because I feel like that safety is what makes us seem like, yeah, we are all welcoming and we are, you know, trying to make sure we bring everyone together. But I think we bring them together like with this wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like it's okay. They'll be regular, normal, like me in the afterlife. So I tolerate them in this life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, Professor
The
Williams,
question.
I especially appreciate, again, as a person, I'll put it this way. I appreciate this as a person who speaks almost always to non-Mormon audiences, right? I'm just almost always. And from where I'm speaking, what I often have to explain is like the presumption is not only just like, well, weird because religious, but also like spectacularly racist across the course of the 19th century. And what I often have to say is like, oh, that's 100% correct, yes. Except also, did you know that they were going to be exterminated several times? Like a truly despised population, which does not excuse their turn to white supremacism. But you can note that it was not, it could not properly be conceived as entirely voluntary. And what I hear you saying is like, right, this was like a haven, like whiteness and white supremacism became like a haven as against extermination, as against annihilation, like a genuinely existential haven. What I hear you saying is that the long tail of that is just like, it's unexpiring. It's gone through the 20th century and into the 21st century, in which like just the grasping to whiteness as the first principle of existential safety has these like roiling consequences in the 20th and 21st century. And I just want to say, like, I appreciate that as a lot as a way to help me, who doesn't know much at all about the 20th and 21st century of Mormonism, help to think about it.
Thank you so much for that. And I think, Brody, you had your hand up halfway through this exchange. Do you want to jump in here?
Hi, yeah, I was just going to very briefly mention on the topic of using the Book of Mormon as a way of eroding that kind of current issue in the church. And I think a good touch point would be to utilize, because I think one of the most radical points in the Book of Mormon is Lehi's dream first off, and then that comparison with the Rameumptom Tower. And I think that focuses that those two pieces highlight a combative relationship between two kinds of desire, not like desire versus not desire. And I think to Williams's point, I think that it's the difference between the fruit, right, which is food. It's like come here and be fed by the gospel versus the tower across the river, right? And what's interesting there is that I think to Williams's point, that's the wink and the nudge. That's this is the big party. This is the hey, you're welcome here. It's a very welcoming scene. It's not at all like, you know, hey, we have like our, you know, it's not fascist. It's not like aggressive. It's just actually just a huge party. It's like, hey, come over, we're hanging out. And I think it's precisely that kind of violence that the Book of Mormon is critical of. Again, to the Rameumptom Tower, this idea of we're already saved, we love this stuff, we're great, God is our guy. That allows for violence towards others who don't map onto the economics of desire that you're working with, I think. So kind of to this kind of framing of the Book of Mormon and using those stories, I'm wondering what you all think about how to wrestle that kind of side of Mormon ideology that produces that desire, that produces this kind of combat between Mormons who are like, well, I'm here because I'm trying to live my best life, which could be at the cost of others, right? Versus Mormonism as a radical perspective of I'm going to potentially sacrifice my grid of desire for the betterment of everyone.
Thank you for that, Brody. As somebody who, like Peter, is not, you know, is not an insider, I think that sort of deep dive into sort of possibilities of textual interpretation, I find really evocative and intriguing. Peter, did you want to respond to this?
Just again, very briefly, because I feel like I'm the least knowledgeable on the thing, but I will follow up by saying that accords very much with the danger of a certain kind of weak inclusivity. Accords very much to my understanding of a fundamental dilemma that for me, Mormonism, sure, you can shine a light through Mormonism, see that follows from what Professor Williams is saying. Just go look, like liberal secularism, which is like a force of planetary imperialism, is a two-fisted engine. And on one side is exploitation, and on the other side is the promise of inclusion. Inclusion and exploitation are the two-fisted engine of liberal secularism. The point of that is like be against all inclusion. Rather, I think with what Professor Williams is saying, like inclusion can take a lot of forms. inclusion can look like a lot of things. Either a deferral inclusion or an inclusion as a way that just burnishes the glory of the system as it works now. Those are the very mechanisms of liberal secularism, which I think Mormonism was made in certain really keen respects as against, but also in conversation with. And that doubleness is sort of like the unresolving problem, just again, as a scholar, as someone I found unbelievably compelling and moving. So that's my brief answer. I'll leave it to
well,
who
thank
know
you.
the text better than I.
And really, one of the lessons that we've all learned over the course of these last 2 semesters is just how fraught and complicated and overdetermined the question of whiteness becomes when we realize really that the Mormon story is part of the cornerstone of the story of white supremacy and whiteness and racism in this country. That it's not, some sort of some marginal, a distant drama playing out at the outskirts of the American frontier or beyond. That it really is central to this story. Now, I want to be respectful of boundaries, and I know we're about at time, but if you all are willing to hang around for just one more question, and if not, that's totally understandable, because I think it's just a sort of a perfect, it leads us to a perfect conclusion, not just for this remarkable conversation, which I cannot thank you all enough for being such a part of today. But it really bears upon everything we've been doing here as students, teachers, and scholars. So I'm going to send it back to Sierra, who kicked us off, and now she's going to lead us out. Sierra, if you would please share your final question with us.
Yes, of course. And I'm actually so glad about this discussion right up into this, because I think it deals a lot with impact, which is kind of the central issue of this question. But like most of us, I was surprised by Dr. Brooks' choice to pull out of the speaker series, though perhaps we could call this a reification of the theory and practice distinction. Brooks has said that she considers herself a scholar who studies and observes, and that on-the-ground anti-racist work in the LDS congregations is beyond the scope of her project. So how do we resist the notion that our only work, or even our most pressing work, is as observing scholars? How do we bridge the gap between academic conversation and earnest action with the power to bring about meaningful change in our communities?
Right. We're going to conclude this conversation with the $6 million question. Would any of the three
define we?
Well, I mean, we're going to conclude this YouTube broadcast. I don't mean to, I didn't mean nothing by it. Peter, please.
Oh, I've talked it. I'll just listen. What will I say? Here's one thing I'll say. I'm a scholar. Like, I have plenty of activism, and this is not where it lies. I am a union person, and that's my thing. But I will say early life is taking seriously the forms of criticism that attach to the work that you put in the world. That's what I'll say. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to enjoy it. But, you know, I'm a person who wrote a bunch of books. You put them in the world, people get to not like them. That seems to me a very basic principle of scholarly. I mean, again, I have nothing. I don't have anything useful to add, because, again, I think Professors Williams and Reeves know better about the 20th and 21st century dilemmas of Mormonism than I do. I will just say, as a scholar, as a person whose relation to this is scholarly, people get to not like what you do. You know what I mean?
Certainly,
Thomas
that is.
Pynchon, a writer I write about, says, like, whatever is fair. And that's a good principle. So anyway, I think Professor Williams and Professor Reeve will have more exacting things to say than that.
Well, thank you for that elegant and important reminder that there is already an ethics at stake in scholarly inquiry and publication, and participating in contributing to the public sphere entails an implicit responsibility. Not that you need to agree with all of your critics or that they need to agree with you, but this this sort of mess is where the work gets done. So thank you. That really resonates for me personally as well. Professor Williams, Professor Reeve. Well, we've got ourselves a standoff. There we
go. Okay, I'll blink. So when you enter the public sphere, you open yourself up for public criticism. So I think that just is a part of, like Dr. Coviello said, a part of the engagement. And I guess the other aspect of the question, Religion of a Different Color, published by an academic press. Is there a way to translate that for a more general audience and engage, people in the pew? And that's sort of where, for me, my academic bleeds over into my religious life. And I choose to engage when I receive, requests. I've spoken to Latter-day Saint congregations this year, and it's tragic to me that the death of George Floyd, that's what it took, right? That's really what it took. But Italy, England, various congregations across the United States, Zoom has obviously facilitated this as well, made it possible. But it's a desire to translate, the scholarship to public audiences, and hope that it might make a difference, to be willing to speak as a white male with all the privilege that I have. But it's largely to, because Latter-day Saint congregations that I'm speaking to are largely white. And, I want to be able to enter those spaces and talk about the power of whiteness, and to try to translate, the academic book into a way that Latter-day Saints in the pew can understand and be willing to engage. And, for some people, it provides answers. For other people, they're dissatisfied and I get branded a heretic or the liberal professor from the U, or, they don't like the message, so they attack the messenger. That's also a part of this public engagement that, I'll be honest, sometimes it stings, and sometimes I go into a funk, and sometimes I think I'm going to just give up. But I guess I believe, there's the idealist in me and there's the realist in me, and they're always in conflict, right? But I guess I believe it's the right thing to do, and so I continue. And the other part of the question, the Century of Black Mormons Project is a public history database. The only cost that it takes is a finger click, and we try to make all of the documents that we can make publicly available. We include those so that other people who might have a different interpretation can make their own interpretation. But what can I do? These are the skills that I have as a historian, right? Like if I'm on Survivor and the food's gone, like the historian's the first person they're going to eat, right? This is my skill set. What can I do to try to contribute? And this is something I can do to try to contribute. And it's in a hope of engaging a public audience in a different way. And, when you do this, you confront criticism, and it has to be a part of the process. Like I said, sometimes it really stings. I'll be perfectly honest, but you engage in the public sphere, that's a part of the price. And so far, I'm committed to continue on that realm. I think it's important. I see myself as a public historian as well as, sort of the academic side of it. And I think there's got to be a way to translate to a general audience. And, so when, for example, Faith Matters blog contacts me and says, will you do an interview and will you write an essay? I get no credit for that in the academic world that, counts these kind of things up. But I also feel like if it can help, then I want to engage. So that's kind of how I approach it.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Williams, would you like to add anything to this?
I will add that when we're studying people and we're studying stories, we're studying things that are happening in the present. And I think it's so important, as Dr. Reeve and Dr. Coviello have both said, to understand like what we do really well and to be open to there being other ways and other contributions that can come from the things that we do really well. I could probably go and work with Paul and we could be working on the same exact data set, but I can promise you we're probably going to get two different outcomes based on how we approach the material. A lot of the conversations that I would love to see happening more often in these spaces around race and religious studies is an understanding of if it's easier for me to access the work, who do I bring along with me? And that was why I really wanted to say thank you to Paul, because LaShawn, will you come on this panel with me? LaShawn, will you come do this? Then the work that he did with the Black, White, and Mormon conference is part of the reason why we did Black LDS Legacy. One, it was to create a space that we felt was not necessarily being created at Black, White, and Mormon. It didn't mean that we didn't support it or didn't contribute or didn't show up, but we said there's more that we can do. And so because we saw what was possible and what people were willing to talk about, we said, okay, how do we tap into the contemporary Black Latter-day Saint experience? All of our experiences can exist within this realm of religious studies. And I think as long as we're able to support each other without feeling threatened by or overshadowed by one another, but also recognizing where our privileges position us, I think we continue to move the work forward. I don't know, for me, I'm a social worker by trade and I'm a scholar by choice. So for me, every story is personal, and being able to move those stories forward is why I can't just be a scholar who studies and observes. Like, my life is my project, and I'm trying to help save lives, save testimonies, save families and connections, and save memberships when I possibly can. And I keep waiting. On the committee, we keep waiting for like a cease and desist letter from headquarters. We haven't gotten one yet. It's important that we see work to do and that we put our shoulders to the wheel and we start doing it. And it takes many hands to make light work. And the work of race and racism is heavy. So we need as many hands in this work as possible. We can be observing scholars, but we do so at a cost. And it's a disservice to connection. And then people start feeling like they're being observed. And it's like the comment that Artie made earlier was that voyeuristic observation. We can't do that to people. No one wants to be talked about. They want to be talked to. And so how do we make our scholarship a talking to with one another as we continue to do this work? Like, we've got to make sure that we're really committed to bringing meaningful change, even if it's going to cost us some standing or maybe, a disagreement, or where we have to offer to take somebody to lunch because I just wanted to make sure I didn't offend them, right? Like, this is the work that we're doing, and I hope that we can continue to do it together in places and spaces like this. So thank you so much for having this conversation.
Yes, thank you. And just let me know when we're getting together for lunch. I guess I missed the details, but I'll be here whenever you're ready.
You're never going to offend me, please.
Yeah, Chicago's not that far away. I just want to say I can make it out.
All right, it's a good food town.
Like
you were
lunch.
coming out here. I thought you were inviting us out there. Well, we'll work out the details. But honestly, I think this was really an extraordinary conclusion to what has been not just a fantastic, almost 2-hour-long conversation at this point, but a really rigorous, robust, inspiring, sometimes confounding, frustrating, confusing, but always interesting conversation that my colleagues and I have been having with our students and with each of you throughout the course of this whole last already bizarre and in its own way singular academic year. I want to thank you not only for your participation in all of these events, but for the work that you're doing and for your commitment to the ethics of inquiry in the public sphere, to your recognition of the impossibility of maintaining a limit between the personal and the political. I think we have explored the past and we do explore the past. We are invested in historical questions because they remind us that the present, with all of its problems, was not an inevitability and did not fall from the sky or grow from the ground. It is the product of many hands, as Professor Williams just said. And for that same reason, many hands can dismantle the aspects of that present that, far from requiring us to retrofit something new on top of them, reveal what is already there. That there is always a promise and a problem at stake in a massive edifice with a name that commands and portends such significance as a religion. There is no way of separating the rational from the, let's say, from the domain of personal belief. In fact, it's an opposition that doesn't make any sense. If we are morally and ethically invested individuals, members of a collective and a community, and scholar thinkers who want to do the dirty work of revealing the contingencies, in many ways, the historical accidents that have led us up to the present, it's because we all are in some way committed to a different future. And while we might not know what that future looks like yet, that's why they call it the future. I think that with scholars like the three of you and with students like ours, to my mind, the future is, for all of the troubles that we are living through today, it grows brighter all the time. And so just a final word of thanks to all of you, to the students, to my colleagues, Brian Birch, Brianne Matheson, and of course, Lydia Kerr. And I am sure that this conversation, without a doubt, will continue. And I very much look forward to being a part of that. So please, everybody, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And thanks, of course, to all of you watching on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed this as much as we have. Bye now.